Well, welcome to this afternoon's session. My name's Gil Pontius. I'm been a geography professor here. I'll be going into my 25th year. Time flies. And so I'm so pleased to be able to moderate this session, if the presenters actually need any moderating. And we have a phenomenal lineup of 5 presenters that give a wide variety of perspectives about geographic information science and Earth system science here at Clark University. So we'll get right to it. Our first presenter is Jim Thatcher. Jim's an associate professor in the School of Urban Studies at the University of Washington in Tacoma. His research examines the recursive relations between data, environment, and society. He is the editor of the journal Geographic Perspectives, the principal investigator and the site director of the Spatial Models and Electoral Districting for the National Science Foundation's Research Experiences for Undergraduate Site. His second book, entitled Data Power, was published in 2022 with Pluto Press, and he earned his doctorate right here at Clark University Graduate School of Geography in 2014. Please welcome Professor Thatcher.
Hi all. These slides didn't export right, and all the images are going to be really pixely, so I do apologize for that. I'm going to try to be brief, because I know there are many folks here who know more of this history and that have lived it. And I don't want to take up their time. But I do want to suggest that from its inception, Clark Graduate School of Geography has made core contributions to cartography in profound ways that parallel many of the contributions it has made to more currently venerated fields like GiScience or even human-environment relations. I'll do so by first introducing myself, which I guess I don't have to do because Gil did a great job, but there's a pun in there that I want to make, so I'm going to make it anyway. Then I'll situate cartography within the founding of this school. And then finally I'm going to turn to what I find an oddly lost, or at least not nearly celebrated as I feel it should be, tradition within Clark. One that begins with a fierce alternative to the then at the time map communication model, and continues through early renditions of indigenous mappings and other worlds. And then I'm going to conclude by turning once more to some of the quotes around the very founding of this august school, and urge us to once more integrate, celebrate, and allow to flourish the traditions of cartography at Clark. So I'll skip most of this because you already said it. Look at how pixely I am. It's great. There's a quick cover of the book. It's free. It's open source. You can grab it if you want. But I'm the editor of Cartographic Perspectives. So when I was thinking of what I could offer this panel, I thought, well, why don't I offer a cartographic perspective? I was really proud of that. So as I know has been mentioned elsewhere, the Graduate School of Geography gets announced in 1921 with Wallace W. Atwood's inauguration speech as president. Wallace was known as a paradigmatic lecturer, capable of drawing cartographic relief with both hands at once while speaking. On the one hand, I'm left to wonder if this bit of trivia is a touch apocryphal, meant to set him as superior to the well-known Erwin Roots, his contemporary at Harvard, and eventually after the department's closing here at Clark, who was renowned for drawing with one hand while lecturing. On the other hand, I do also wonder if we should perhaps make such a feat a requirement to assume the role of director today, or at least require incoming directors to attempt it. More seriously, I begin with this quote because within this special field, cartography was very much an early and significant part. Oh, there's a picture of him. From these selective quotes, which are all from Clark University and Narrative History by William A. Kolsch, I want to establish 2 things. First, is that cartography was a significant part of our program from the beginning. And as I struggle with my notes. And second, that our program was a major player from its inception. I feel like many folks here are willing to embrace the latter, right? Why not be a part of something that's a big deal? But the former often gets lost in the shuffle, in my view, which is a shame because it's precisely what makes Clark so strong. Its integrative approach, the way members are willing to pursue interests across and betwixt specializations that caused it to have such a fascinating history within the field. one that I'm going to continue to call attention to. So again, 2 points. First, I have limited time, and so I'm being selective in the gestures and the arguments that I'm making. It's an incomplete one. And second, to reiterate, I come to this after the fact. Some of the people on this panel, many of you in this room, lived through this. Heck, I couldn't even find a definitive date for when the Clark University Cartographic Lab closed, and or if it was the same as the Clark University Cartographic Services. In fact, if you look at various publications that cite to them, it changes over time. There's an archive here.
Is it on?
There's a story to tell, and I'm hoping
Really
it gets
close.
told over this
Okay.
weekend. But here, I want to try to convince you why it's so worth telling.
All right.
My contention is that cartography, and here I mean the creation and study of maps, is distinct from the application of cartography within other fields of study. As it was practiced and researched at Clark, offers one of the more important lost threads within our discipline, specifically due to 2 factors. One is the development of an early alternative to the dominant and limited map communication model and here what you find in Clark is a tying of behavioral science into cartographic inquiry long before it becomes a standard practice in the 90s. And I also see a significant engagement with and fostering of critical and radical approaches to cartography that dovetailed with other work in this area from the program, but arose specifically due to the integrative and interdisciplinary approaches encouraged here. Again, I can't really fully outline all of this, but suffice it to say that in the 1950s, it was pretty standard to teach the gospel according to Robinson, is the famous quote here, where you take Arthur Robinson's applications, which he did not create the map communication model, but he leveraged it heavily. But that wasn't what was taught at Clark. Rather, due to the influence of Kevin Lynch, his image of the city, and ties between Clark geography and psychology, Clark ends up fostering a psychogeography quite distinct from the map communication model that swept through the rest of the American cartographic world. Cates and Woolhill will use the term psychogeography in a special issue in 1967. David Stay arrives in the late 60s, and by 1967 is offering what is believed to be the first university course ever offered in the area. Here it's important to note as an aside, and I'll be very brief because of the disruption of time, is that this psychogeography is distinct from the Situationist International and Guy Debord's psychogeography. If you're interested in that, there's a great piece in Cartographica called Lynch Debord about 2 psychogeographies that charts the differences in histories. But what Clark did offer was an alternative to the idea of a unilateral means of judging maps, rather by judging them through the behavior of the map reader. As McClearly puts it, when you stop looking at old maps from an archival perspective and focus on the fact that it is not the map which is most significant, but rather the behavior which produced the map and the behavior which resulted from its use, then the role of any map or any group of maps becomes easy to understand. While I may quibble with the ease of understanding there, for those familiar with the trajectories of modern cartography within the American Academy, this is a rather profound statement. In recognizing the limitations of the MCM in the 90s, Alan McEachran, who incidentally trains under McCleary after he leaves Clark, echoes it. Similarly, the more recently popular ontogenetic approaches to understanding of maps from Perkins, Kitchen, Dodge, and et cetera from the mid-2000s, they also echo it. Yet here it is at Clark in the 1960s. One should note that Ron Eastman was also highly influential in this area, as were many of his students, such as Jean Ellen McKendry, and just to reiterate, my telling here is obviously partial. I'll leave to others to tell the story of Clark's geography role in critical and radical geography. From the founding of Antipode to the more recent human geography, it's immense. Folks like Matt Huber, Renee Tabb, Chris Knudsen, they've all written about this, and you should seek it out if you're interested. But what's left out is the cartographic work that developed from that same wellspring. Sure, we often get references to Dennis Wood's prolific dissertation. I don't want to, but I will. The introduction to which was still being passed around like contraband during my time as a grad student at Clark. And it's hard to overstate the influence of his practices in critical cartography. But lost sometimes in the shuffle are so many other profoundly influential works of cartographic practice and theory that emerged from Clark University. Here I want to call particular attention to the work of Margaret Wickens Pierce, whose early work on indigenous cartographies under Harry Stewart at Clark produced some of the most profoundly influential work in this realm. And again, indigenous cartographies is a hot topic now in the 2020s for cartographers, yet here it is at Clark in the 90s. And I'd like to apologize for including this early sketch map from Pierce's dissertation, particularly since it says preview over it. I'll replace it with this excerpt from her Champlain map. They would not take me there, which is one of the most beautiful data visualizations I've ever seen. So I'm short on time and there's much to say. I'd like to leave us with a quote from Dr. Finley, who was at the time the editor of the New York Times, and this is from the founding celebration of our august school. I picked this quote not the least because it seems to strike at the heart of the type of geographical analysis that continues at Clark. It's not just to tell us of the Earth, but of how to change it, how to make claims upon it, and to make it a better place. Further, while we continue to celebrate and conduct brilliant and groundbreaking work on the application and analysis of spatial data, I worry that we've sometimes forgotten those cartographic roots. I am not, nor would I, call for a wholesale reimagining of the curriculum around cartography. But I'd love to see both a greater celebration of its history at Clark, as well as perhaps more collaborative work between the explicitly cartographic and the economic and the human, and so on. Look, if Dick Peake can get the Clark University Cartography Laboratory to make this amazing image in 1969, what might we be able to do today? So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Oh, it's a great honor for me to introduce our next presenter, Professor Ron Eastman, who's director of Clark Labs, creator of the Adresi and GIS, the Adresi GIS and Terset Geospatial Modeling Suite. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure to work at Clark Labs, but it's a remarkable place. It gives our students extraordinary experiences. Professor Eastman is certainly very technically competent, but what's really remarkable about Clark Labs is Professor Eastman has set up a social setting where people feel extremely comfortable in discussing what the challenges are and how to go about those solutions. And it's one thing I've been recently observing, that is just a crucial key to learning, to make that social environment open for discussion. And that's an equally impressive skill as your technical skills, Ron. Ron is now Emeritus Professor of the Graduate School of Geography, and having served on the faculty for 38 years, from 1981 to 2019, including 3 years as the director of the Graduate School of Geography. Professor Ron Eastman.
Thank you. I have to get used to which way to point things. Okay. So I came here in 1981. That was 42 years ago, if you do the math. So I've been not quite half of those 100 years, but a big chunk of them. And I came here on a one-year position. I was to fill in for a faculty member on sabbatical, Harry Stewart, you mentioned. And I was asked to teach courses in cartography, which was my discipline. This is what cartography was in 1981. We had an extensive darkroom, and we taught the techniques for scribing and typesetting to actually make the negatives directly to produce the printing plates. It was an interesting technology, and I really, really enjoyed it. But I also had other interests, one of them which was in computing. And when I arrived to speak to Len Berry, who was director at the time, about staying at Clark for a year to teach during Harry's sabbatical, he said, after we'd agreed on the terms and how much I'd be underpaid, I kid you not, my salary was $16,000. He said, just before you go, he said, I want to show you something. So we went downstairs into the closet, which frequently floods. It's like Fort Lauderdale. And there were some packing crates with a digitizing tablet, which you can see up there, a very small plotter, plotted 8.5 by 11. And this thing, that's Billy Turner. No, sorry, I'm joking. This thing, which was a computer. It was the first computer in the department. And Led said, okay, so we got this thing on a grant that was applied for by a visiting professor who's just left when this arrived. We don't know what to do with it. Do you know what to do with it? And I said, well, I've never used it, but I think I could figure it out. He said, fine. This is, by the way, 2 weeks before the semester starts. He said, can you teach a course in automated cartography? And I did. Well, there was no software for this thing. It had 5K of memory, for those of you who are geek enough to understand the significance of that. No hard drive because they didn't exist for microcomputers at those time. It was a tape drive. You can see the tapes here. And so I taught a programming class for students. I had some from the computer science program, some from geography, who then learned, we actually learned together on how to produce software to produce thematic maps. So I also had a great love at that time for remote sensing. I was really intrigued by the technology, and I so much wanted to get involved in digital remote sensing. But at that particular time, this is what you would require to do digital image processing. That's a GE Image 100, and at the time I started here at Clark, the going price for that was a little over $1 million. Needless to say, that was outside of geography's budget. So we'll move on to the next slide. Mid-1980s, all right, so now I'm still stuck here in this visiting position. I think it was the longest visiting position in the department. And this was the state of GIS. This was just beginning to emerge on people's sort of radar screens. And to get involved, there was software. So this is an early version of ArcInfo, not the PC ArcInfo, but the original ArcInfo. You needed to have something like this at a minimum. So this is a mini computer. That was actually quite cheap, comparatively speaking, around $20,000 at that time. The software, though, called ArcInfo, Jack sent me a letter because I had inquired whether we could get a license, and he said, no problem, I'll give you an educational discount for $180,000. So I thought, okay, let's move on. And so I decided to write my own. And so that was the origins of Idrisi, which I started in 1986, and we released first in 1987. It's the first system that was actually devised specifically for a microcomputer platform. Microcomputers were, to me, intriguing, but they were sort of limited. They had limited RAM, they had limited ability for input-output, but I invested my time in thinking about how to develop the algorithms that would allow a small little device to actually do major work. And instead of the main system at that time that you could, and it was the system I taught my first GIS class, that had a maximum size of image of 171 columns by 171 rows. This, instead of trying to put all the images in memory, actually it worked through an iterative process of computing only one row at a time and then sending it out to display devices. And so I wrote versions for initially a DEC Microvax, then DEC Rainbow, and IBM PC. They had different operating systems, and eventually for some of the new equipment that came on the IBM PS2. And as a result of that, the NCGIA, when they developed their first national curriculum in GIS, made the decision to use Idrisi as the system for the tutorials. Likewise, UNEP Grid and Unitar that had a program funded by the Swiss Development Corporation to proselytize about GIS and teach people globally, they also decided to use Idrisi as their system. And many of the graduate students at that time ended up being trainers and worked all over the world for UNEP and Unitar. All right, so this is not as it was in '87. The equipment was a little bit more primitive, but it evolved quickly, as did the technology. And it was a raster system. I'm a devout Rastafarian, as many of you know. To me, this was magic, all right, absolute magic, because I could incorporate, for example, satellite imagery into the analysis. It wasn't about making maps, it was about analysis. I debated about whether to call it a geographic analysis system, but I'm afraid the acronym just didn't work. So, but But to me, it was magic because what you had was a surrogate environment that you could look at in many different ways, and you could experiment with, such as, for example, cascading precipitation onto a landscape and tracing out how it ran across that landscape to get the whole hydrographic network. That, to me, was total magic. And just to illustrate that, the concept that this led to, which was not a display system, not map as communication. This was the map as an analytical medium. This was information science. I began to see myself truly as an information scientist. And I give this example here from the Earth Trends Modeler. Florencia San Germano worked with me on this one, and it was an interesting process. We had a grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to create what became the Earth Trends Modeler. And it was to work with time series of satellite imagery. And one of the things that they most particularly wanted to have was something that could capture changes in plant phenology over the year. And that's a difficult thing to do because your imagery sources for that information has all kinds of short-term noise. It's very, very noisy data. And the logic typically used was to focus on events like bud burst or the first leaf fall and so on. We thought about it and came up with a technique to use something called Fourier analysis to actually model the complete annual curve and one that shed all of the sources of variability. Produces a map like this that has all these wonderful colors. What the colors represent is changes in seasonality. The critical color is gray. If it's gray, there's no change in the seasonality. It's stable over time. Don't see much gray there, right? It's so dynamic, it's unbelievable. Florencia, I remember particularly, struggled with the concept of how do we develop a legend for this? It's so friggin' complex. And so what we eventually came up with was this logic of an interactive legend where you would take an area of interest. So I took this area in the Alabama, Georgia area. I used a little circular device to define an area, and then it traces out here. Here's the year, January through December. This is vegetation productivity. And you see in green what it looked like at the beginning of the series in 1982, and in red at the end of the series in 2010. You can see an increase in productivity throughout the year, but particularly an increasing bimodality as time goes on. And that's a trend that goes all the way down the East Coast and gets even more extreme. That's information science. You know, we looked at it as a problem and said, how do we get at that information? How do we get rid of the stuff that we don't want to look at? Also, about that time, things are developing rapidly. We developed a lot of competitors. So we're a small university. How are we going to survive in that? We decided actually not to survive in the traditional sense. Rather than focusing on the traditional GIS and image processing, which is the Idrisi part, that's those parts right there, we decided to, while maintaining that, to add on all these different elements that dealt with tools for responsible environmental stewardship. Tools like the Habitat and Biodiversity Modeler, the Ecosystem Services Modeler, and so on. I'll highlight a couple here and then close. So this is one that's near and dear to my heart. It's the Earth Trends Modeler that I mentioned before. What's distinctive here is that you're not going to find this in any other software, period. Nothing even like it. It's the only thing that exists like this. So this is something that deals with a long time series of Earth observation data. In this case, I've taken 3 different data sets of 360 images each of sea surface temperature, middle tropospheric temperatures, and lower stratospheric temperatures. And I've used a technique here, giving it the 3 different data sets and said, okay, on these 3 different data sets, find, if you can, one pattern that's common to all of them over time. And that's what it found. And here's the manifestation in space. So it shows you the correlation with that pattern in space for those 3 different data sets. For those of you who are familiar with this, you will recognize that this is El Nino, obviously, something that we've got heading our way for next winter. And one more illustration, and then that's my last slide. The land change modeler in GeoMod. This was something, again, that's very distinctive. You don't find this in ArcGIS, it's not going to be there, right? It's very specialized, and to support it, you need specialized people who know what they're doing. And so this is built upon the expertise of people like Gil and Florencia and John, who have spent years focusing on the very difficult problem of analyzing land cover change and trying to predict it into the future. This is, I would say, the largest enduring legacy of Idrisi and what became known as TerraSet as we added on all these satellite elements. I looked this week just to check on this. I do it every so often, and in Google Scholar, and found that at the moment there are over 5,000 professional papers that have used either one of these two tools in the development of their research. That's a legacy I think that we can be happy with, and it involves a very broad participation within the department. So with that, I will pass it on.
So Professor Eastman is one of the reasons we even have a session on GIS here at the Graduate School of Geography. And obviously our programs in GIS have students at the center, and we are players in all three phases of the game in student education. That's the bachelor's level, master's level, and doctoral level. Our first master's program began in 1996, and now we have two master's programs in GIS. One program receives students from outside of Clark, and another program is specifically for students who did so well in their first 4 years at Clark. They get a scholarship for an additional year where they do a master's degree, which is the case in our next presenter. Suzie Birdsell graduated from Clark with a bachelor's degree in both geography and women's and gender studies in 2015, and then a master's degree in GIS in 2016. Her master's thesis incorporated data from the Central Massachusetts Regional Planning Commission and the Worcester Regional Transit Authority. Her thesis focused on how transit could better serve travel patterns in the region. After graduating from Clark, she was hired by Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, where she has been planning transit for 7 years. The technical and qualitative training she received at Clark informs her daily work analyzing travel patterns, demographic trends, and network analyses, while also bringing a critical lens to the way that census travel and other data are collected in ways that can lead to inequitable and incorrect conclusions. Please welcome Suzie Birdsell.
Thank you, Gil. Do we have the clicker here? Yeah. Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Among so many people who taught me so much, Jim was actually the TA for the first GIS class I ever took as an undergrad, and Ron was GIS professor for my last semester in undergrad, and also so many other faces who I've learned from, so thank you for having me. Today I'm going to be speaking about understanding underlying transit demand in Philadelphia, where we are doing a lot of work. I wanted to speak specifically about how my training at Clark really informed the ways that underlying markets for transit are understood, and how I was able to bring both my geography, GIS, and also women and gender studies training to push that further and think about the ways that census data and other data that is commonly used in this practice is used that might lead to incorrect and inequitable outcomes. So to start to understand transit demand, we always start with densities of population. In the Philadelphia region, the darker the red, the denser the population. And in the surrounding areas, you can see that the city of Philadelphia itself is extraordinarily dense and has very, very high demand for transit. In much of the rest of the country that has been planned to be very auto-oriented, there are many what we might think of as more suburban neighborhoods in Philadelphia that have as much underlying transit demand as places like downtown Phoenix or downtown Dallas. But it's not just about understanding where concentrations of people live, but also who those folks are and how likely they are to ride transit. Philadelphia is a very segregated city, you can see that on the left-hand side, this map, the kind of neon green color is Black residents, and blue is Hispanic residents, red is Asian residents, and that tan color is white residents. The Hispanic and Black residents in particular are very concentrated in certain neighborhoods, but so are white residents in South Philly as well as the counties surrounding it. Same with zero-car households and low-income residents, which also tend to take transit more often than the population at large. So many places think through, many other firms and people who study this think about these different dynamics separately of where people live and people live in general and where the populations who are more likely to take transit live. And I tend to think about how can we make maps and bring together data to simplify concepts as much as possible. So this idea of thinking through resident transit propensity brings together those three different variables of vehicle ownership, income levels, and race, and turns it into one variable of thinking about how much more likely different areas are to ride transit than other places in those residents, and the fact that we need to serve those places with more frequent and better transit. And what that leads to is being able to adjust the population density by those factors. And you can see that many areas that are bright red, just while mapping the population density, become even more intensely bright red when adjusting for demographic factors, as well as the suburbs become paler because there really are proportionally less transit demand in those areas. And what that means is that it may seem intuitive, but often there is concentration on bringing transit to new areas, often richer white areas, when we should be concentrating as much public transit into regions with dense populations and dense proportions of transit-dependent residents as possible. Another very important part of understanding transit demand is thinking through employment density. Traditionally in travel demand modeling, the main trip that is being modeled is thinking through where someone lives and where someone works. And this is actually very biased towards white middle-class men, because in general, we know that white men who are more likely to have 9-to-5 jobs, they're more likely to travel directly from their home to their work location without stopping in between. So again, we tend to be planning for those people who are least likely to take public transit. So while mapping employment is a great start, we need to start thinking about where folks are traveling, particularly women and lower income folks and minorities and folks with no vehicle, and focusing on different types of locations that are drawing ancillary demand. And this is a map showing jobs with the who also attract customers, clients, patients, and students in addition to just people who work in these locations. COVID really revealed the fact that while most transit agencies plan for 9-to-5 work, have during peak periods, things like that, that the folks who continued to ride transit during the pandemic had shift times that started all throughout the day. And those folks were also more likely to work in those activity centers in the previous map that also attract customers, clients, patients, and students. So a lot, when we think about census data and travel data that's collected, A, that's assuming that someone is traveling directly from their residence to their job center, but B, it also assumes that you are starting work at the same time every day, working consistent days throughout the week, things like that. And we know that almost a third of workers without a college degree do not leave for work at the same time every day, and non-traditional commuters tend to cluster in low-income areas. So we can't use those traditional measures to understand transit demand for those who need it most. In addition, I've really loved being able to bring my gender studies degree into transit planning and thinking about the particular needs of gender. And just wanted to shout out Susan Hansen and all of her work that she did while at Clark that really, really informed how I think about gender and travel. Women have different trip patterns and needs than men. They tend to make more trips, do more household errands and childcare. They tend to trip chain, which means on the way to work, they might drop a child off at school. And women are more likely to work multiple jobs. So while women still have a lower labor participation rate than men, women, at least in the Philadelphia region, actually work more of the jobs than men because they're so much more likely to have multiple jobs. So this map is showing where there are higher concentrations of jobs worked by women in green, and there are many, many women-dominated employment sites, and we need to think through how we best serve both the employees that work in these areas and those who need to reach these areas because they're more likely to be areas with healthcare, things like that, and how we can design transit systems to meet those needs. This seems like a lot to keep in mind at once, but when you start to think through how all of these different variables I brought up come together, low-income folks' needs, those without a car, women, what it really comes down to is that most people who rely on transit the most need frequent, good transit service all day, and we need to stop relying on service that focuses on a 9-to-5 commute and start focusing on, yes, travel needs and travel patterns all day, and that will lead to the most equitable outcome. So I also wanted to point to other gender-related work that has been done in this area. The LA Metro did a really, really nice study that showed that women riders are more likely to be transit critical, so low income, no access to vehicle, et cetera, and that women also compromise the majority of bus riders, even though transit service is less likely to meet their needs because they are trip chaining, because they are traveling off peak, because they have part-time jobs, things like that. And women are more likely to travel than men at midday and also evenings. And also women tend to bring children on transit and are more likely to travel with large bags and strollers. So it's not just about designing service, it's about designing the vehicles themselves as well. There's also been some nice studies in Canada looking at the particular needs of women. This mostly shows things that I have already covered. And some of the solutions that they have focused on are in exploring novel ways to gather real-time gender-based data collection, leverage customer satisfaction surveys to collect gender-specific data, implementing gender-informed metrics to service standards, incorporated gender lens as part of the introduction of new transit technologies, and integrate gender equality evaluations into business cases and planning processes. I think that all of these are such important recommendations, and I think can also better lead to the way that data is collected from the get-go, and also can inform the ways that we use existing data, such as I presented in these maps, to think through the biases that led to both collecting this data, but also using it to lead to more equitable outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzie. The Graduate School of Geography has 4 foci, one of which is GIS and remote sensing. That sounds too merged together. Another is Earth System Science. So our last 2 presenters are professors of Earth System Science here at Clark University. Dominik Kulakowski is professor of both geography and environmental science here at Clark. He has published on various aspects of forest ecology, management, and policy with co-authors from dozens of countries. His work has been covered by USA Today, Los Angeles Times, Christian Science Monitor, and other popular outlets in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Switzerland, and China. He has worked with governmental and non-governmental organizations domestically and abroad. Also, he has testified about his research on several occasions to the United States Congress. Professor Kulakowski.
Thanks, all. It's great to be here with all of you. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the branch of Earth system science that deals with forest ecology, and to share with you some of the themes and questions we've been pursuing. So climate change is affecting ecological systems directly. For example, through changes in temperature and precipitation affecting plant establishment, growth, and survival. It's also affecting ecological systems indirectly, and indeed globally we've been seeing an amplification of forest fires, insect outbreaks, and other types of disturbances. And these two variables interact to what we can, to determine what we can call ecosystem resilience, which is the ability of a system to recover from and tolerate change without shifting to a different state controlled by fundamentally different processes. And indeed, we're living at a time of remarkable ecological change. At the same time, ecosystems are inherently dynamic, and they exist in only two states: gradual change and abrupt change. You will not find another type of ecosystem. And because of this, it's important to contextualize and to understand what changes are being driven by climate change or other pressures, and which are a part of natural ecosystem variability. In order to be able to say that what we're seeing is unprecedented, we have to know the precedent. And so one of the themes that we've been pursuing is related to establishing that precedent. It's related to understanding long-term ecological variability, to understand how climate change is in fact driving ecosystems into a different direction. Working with Dan Jarvis, who was a PhD student here several years ago, we were, for example, able to, in this figure up here, the gray areas depict areas that are affected by an outbreak of a tree-killing insect across Western North America. And we were able to use tree ring methods to reconstruct the outbreaks of this insect going back several centuries. We found evidence of synchronous and widespread outbreaks, meaning that not all aspects of this disturbance are in fact unprecedented. Not all are due to human-caused climatic pressures. And the details of these studies help us contextualize which aspects that we're seeing are in fact unprecedented and need to be addressed. Similarly, a few years ago, I worked with colleagues across Europe to do something similar. We focused on remnant old-growth patches of forest, which hold clues about long-term developmental history. And we use that to categorize different types of disturbances in different mountain regions going back several centuries across the continent. This is very helpful, and the details of this are helpful for, again, understanding which of the processes that are playing out in landscapes right now are indeed unprecedented versus just being extremely inconvenient. That's an important distinction. When we get into those details, we do see that some facets of ecological processes are in fact unprecedented. And we see many landscapes globally being affected by multiple types of disturbances. So for example, here in this figure, we see a depiction of areas burned over a 30-year period in western the US. Here is an area, the same area, affected by outbreaks of tree-killing insects. One of the most natural responses both on the science and the policy side, is that when we have multiple undesirable processes playing out in the landscape, is that we assume that there's a causal relationship. And we've spent quite a bit of time looking at scenarios like this, where we see multiple disturbances in the same landscape. And we find examples in North America and elsewhere in the world where we see that instead of an actual causal relationship between different types of disturbances, what is happening is that both disturbances might have a common climatic driver. So this is important for both understanding the basic ecology of those systems and also for deriving intelligent policy responses. So we have to know what to do. Should we change forest structure? Will that do anything? Or should we be primarily focused on the underlying climatic drivers? Similarly, recently worked with colleagues on kind of a global assessment across the temperate forest biome to look at the drivers of forest disturbances over the past several decades. And we did find that high disturbance activity is consistently linked to warmer and drier conditions. But importantly, we also found that the causes of disturbance patterns are highly variable. And in some places, land use actually has a much more important effect on ecological processes than does climate. We live at a time when we correctly see that climate change is affecting so many aspects of ecological systems. That doesn't mean that climate change is affecting all aspects of ecological systems and that climate change is to blame for everything. Again, if we want to respond to these changes, we have to be clear about the underlying drivers. So with this amplification of disturbances due to climate change, land use, and other drivers, one of the other critical questions that comes up is what happens after these disturbances? And what we see in this regard is major variability in post-disturbance regeneration, which of course is key to ecological resilience and for the ability of ecosystems to persist. And we've been pursuing this theme. We've been Jackie Guz was a PhD student here several years ago working on this topic. Nate Gill, who's now at Texas Tech on the faculty there, was working on these topics. And we use a combination of tree ring data, which give us insight into very long-term ecosystem development, where we're able to look at how post-disturbance regeneration has played out over the past century or longer. We have permanent plots where we station PhD students and to report back every year about demography, about establishment, growth, survival, very time-intensive and unbeatable data. And we also use various remote sensing products to look at changes in post-disturbance regeneration over shorter time periods, but over broader, over larger areas and more complex environmental settings. The essence of what we're finding from these studies is that for a long time, we may have had different types of forests being affected by disturbances and then eventually coming back to something similar, given time and allowing for successional trajectories. What we're seeing in the Anthropocene quite often is post-disturbance environments looking like something like this. A complete absence of regeneration. We can call it ecosystem collapse. We can call it alternate stable states. People call it different things. But any way you look at it, this is a problem. This is a problem for for the function of the Earth system. It's a problem for provisioning of ecosystem services. What we're also seeing, though, is changes in forest types that, as far as we know, are unprecedented. And in some cases represent disturbance-mediated adaptive resilience, which is an opportunity. And so one of the themes we're pursuing is understanding where these different processes are playing out, under which environmental conditions. And this is helping inform conversations about where we have a chance to resist ecosystem change, where we do not have that a likelihood of that succeeding, and where we should accept ecosystem change, and where there might be opportunity to direct it towards something that will be more resilient in the future. Similarly, we just got done working on this project with about 50 other folks from North America. And I would just draw your attention to these two figures up here, where we looked at the capacity of forests to regenerate following wildfires in the western United States and projected that into the future. And the areas that are red in both of these are areas where it is very unlikely that forests will regenerate and persist in the near future. But there are other areas that are blue if disturbance severity is low, but that are red where disturbance severity is high. These are areas where management might be able to affect disturbance severity and therefore promote ecosystem persistence. It's given finite resources, we have to prioritize. And this type of work helps us focus in on areas where we have a chance. And like other colleagues in this room and on this panel, we communicate our work in scientific outlets and so forth. And we also work with government agencies and both domestic and international for assuring that the best available science gets to policymakers and decision makers. And we also work with various NGOs to help refine those strategies. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dominik. Well, after our final presenter, all five of our presenters will be up here for the panel discussion, which will go till quarter after the hour. But now for our final presenter, Professor Karen Frey, whose innovative research combines field measurements, satellite remote sensing, and GIS to study large-scale linkages among land, atmosphere, ocean, and ice in polar environments. Over the past 25 years, she has conducted field-based research in West and East Siberia, the North Slope of Alaska, as well as the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas. Her most recent work focuses on the biological and biogeochemical impacts of sea ice decline in polar shelf environments, as well as the hydrological and biogeochemical impacts of terrestrial permafrost degradation across the Arctic. She has been a faculty member in the Graduate School of Geography for 16 years, where she teaches and advises students concerning climate change, polar science, and remote sensing. Please welcome Karen Frey.
Thanks so much, Gil. It's so lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to try to attempt to straddle the Earth system science, geospatial analytics divide a bit to give you sort of an example of some of our work. What you're seeing here is actually the two islands that are smack dab in the center of Bering Strait that separate Russia from Alaska in the US. Big Diomede Island is Russian. Little Diomede Island is US, and they're 2 miles apart. The entire Bering Strait, actually, that separates the two continents are 50 miles apart. And it's basically the only Pacific inflow for a huge amount of nutrients, fresh water, ocean circulation from the Pacific into the Arctic Ocean proper. If you look at the research that I've done within the Polar Science Research Lab with my students, who I see many of in the room today, which I'm very excited about, it kind of shakes out into 3 different spheres. Our work has focused on sea ice and Arctic marine ecosystems. It's focused on the biogeochemistry of permafrost environments, and also glacier ice sheet and snowmelt dynamics. We also use a variety of different methods. We spend a lot of time in the field collecting in situ observations. We spend a lot of time with remote sensing and geospatial analytics and modeling as well. You can see the variety of field sites that we've had in both polar regions since arriving at Clark as well. Today, I'm primarily going to give some examples on the sea ice and marine Arctic ecosystems side of things. In terms of how we have experienced climate change across the planet, the Arctic in particular has warmed nearly 4 times faster than the global average. You can certainly see basic line plots of how that manifests, but certainly as we look at animations and as things are coming together in an animation, you can really see how temperatures have warmed quite dramatically at high latitude regions, in particular in the Arctic. A consequence of that warming, and also how this feeds back into the warming itself as positive feedback mechanisms, sea ice has really changed in a remarkable way. If you look at satellite observations of sea ice from the late 70s until current, we've seen some really dramatic declines, some really interesting end member outliers that in and of themselves have some really interesting stories that we won't go into today necessarily. But essentially, if you can kind of visualize this change, on an annual basis, we've lost about 79,000 square kilometers per year, which equates to about the size of 1 South Carolina per year, if that gives you some perspective of the spatial loss of this sea ice extent. You can see on the right there generally how sea ice looked back in the late 1970s, 1980, and the record still for the lowest seasonal sea ice minimum is in 2012. We've been funded by the National Science Foundation since 2013 for a project called the Distributed Biological Observatory across the Pacific Arctic region. You can see the map on the left essentially highlights these DBO sites, which really denote biological hotspot areas that have been revisited for, in many cases, up to 35 years. So we have this really amazing long-term field-based record of how these changes have taken place due to seawater warming and sea ice decline. These are some of the most marine, the highest rates of marine biological productivity in the world. They have incredible amounts of production, not only in the water column, but also across the seafloor as well in these benthic ecosystems. In particular, our fieldwork has actually taken place on the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, which is a Canadian icebreaker. It's 272 feet long, so it's quite a platform. Many of my students in the audience have spent a lot of time on the ship as well. We collect about 1,000 samples over about a 10-day period. So it's an incredibly intensive field sampling program. You can get a sense of the map on the left of really how sea ice has changed over this time span as well. So this essentially is incredibly seasonally dynamic. In March, when we have seasonal sea ice maximum, you can get a sense of how things have changed over decades. So the Bering Sea has sort of seen some really interesting changes. Primarily, as you can see here in 2018 and 2019, we saw some really dramatic declines with some really profound ecosystem consequences that I will talk a little bit more about tomorrow in a different panel. But as you look at sort of the declines per decade, we see some really remarkable changes across the Chukchi Sea as well, north of Bering Strait. So I mentioned we take a lot of field samples. My two current PhD students that you see here are collecting water on what's called CTD, which stands for Conductivity, Temperature, and Depth. You can sort of see the outcome of some of these, in particular, chlorophyll samples. And as you take a slice through these DBO sites, DBO 1, 2, 3, with Bering Strait sort of in the middle there, you could really sort of get this nice indication of where biological productivity exists across these areas. Thinking a little bit about the importance of our field observations for calibrating and interpreting our satellite time series, it's incredibly important. You can just see sort of an example of a Landsat image with Bering Strait, and I mentioned those two islands at the very beginning. You can see how they shake out here. As I mentioned, it's an incredibly important inflow of a huge amount of nutrients, fresh water, and other biogeochemical constituents as well. The color of the water denotes, in many cases, primary production. Half of all global photosynthesis occurs in the world's oceans. So while terrestrial photosynthesis is quite important, we also can't forget about the marine aspects of things as well as we think about the impacts of climate change. And thinking about how that manifests in terms of our interpretation and understanding from a perspective of remote sensing and geospatial analytics. I just wanted to show one sort of example that feeds back into much of Ron's groundbreaking work with Earth Trends Modeler as well. He sort of set the stage with sort of the technological advances. And I just wanted to mention a sort of pretty straightforward example about how we're using this software to help us interpret change across these distributed biological observatory sites as well. So mean annual primary productivity. These are based on ocean color data that gives us a sense of chlorophyll concentrations, but then these are modeled data that give us a sense of how much carbon production we actually have across an annual time frame. So you're basically just seeing a climatological mean on the left. On the right, we have a long enough time series now that we can really get a sense of where the hotspots of change are in the water column. Hashed marks are indicating statistical significance. But I mentioned that sort of DBO3 site here has been really, really important in terms of detecting change. And in particular, we see green colors indicating increases in primary productivity. We can also, look and see how sea ice has changed as well, which is a really pretty straightforward parameter to remotely sense. You're just seeing the mean on the left, and it's a really incredibly seasonally dynamic area. You can see in the lower reaches, the more southern reaches of the Bering Sea, we may only have a few days per year where sea ice exists. As you work your way through all of these DBO sites all the way up towards the Arctic Ocean proper, we have multi-year ice, which essentially is ice that survives the summer season that exists for 365 days a year. You can see sort of how these trends manifest across space as well. And in particular, as I mentioned, the really big changes that we've seen in the Bering Sea, which are really having some massive consequences for marine ecosystems in terms of harmful algal blooms, in terms of the closure of numerous fisheries for the first time in history across Alaska. So some really sort of major consequences along the way. And so ETM has really allowed us to get a sense of how important sea ice is for dictating how primary productivity in these ocean waters behave. And so you can look at the coefficient of determination, you can look at a sense of the slope of the relationship between primary productivity and the number of open water days per year, which is what you're seeing here. And there's really some important insight that we can glean using ETM, using Terasite, to give us a sense of how these variables behave with one another. And so for instance, at an example with DBO1, you can see you have a relatively important positive correlation between mean annual primary productivity and the mean length of open water season. But I mentioned that DBO3 site is also incredibly important and even more so. So when you look, for instance, at these relationships and how this enables us to get a sense of the strength of that relationship and the slope of that relationship. At DBO3, for every single open water day that gets added per year, we're adding up to 3.8 grams of carbon per meter square per year in terms of production. So you can see really how important these insights are for determining these relationships. And it might give you insight, for instance, that these areas that are really have quite high slopes are quite light limited in terms of production. So every single day of sea ice loss matters quite a bit because there's sufficient nutrients for that production to continue to occur. So giving us insight into these relationships, we can take these types of information, feed them into our predictive models to give us a sense of what may come as we're thinking about, for instance, an ice-free Arctic Ocean in the decades to come. So with that, I just wanted to mention that this type of work has been funded by all sorts of different entities. And I mostly want to say a huge thank you to all my amazing students who I've really had the great privilege of working with over this last 16 years of being at Clark. They're some of the most amazing experiences that I've had. And so I'm very, very thankful for being at Clark because of them. So thank you. Right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frey. Now, I will ask all of our distinguished panelists to take the stage, to which you can direct to them your questions for the next 10 minutes. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will deliver you the microphone. I give to you Michael Cecil, a doctoral student here at Clark.
Thanks so much, everyone. Really interesting to see everyone's work. This question is for Suzie on the transportation in Philadelphia. I think it's a really fascinating issue. We're seeing a lot of work in equity in transportation, and like Worcester has made bus fares free. Boston has piloted a lot of routes and I think tried to change some of the frequencies. And so I'm just wondering, how much sort of impact do you think these studies are having? Is it causing cities like Philadelphia or elsewhere to really change their policies significantly? Or do you think that's still, a few years away?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So based on the work that my firm has done, so the presentation I was giving was primarily about bus service, but we're also helping SEPTA, the agency down there, look at their regional rail system. And they actually just made a major change in their budget to allow for lower fares on regional rail in the core of Philadelphia. And we are hoping to, in the next couple of years, make major fare changes to the rail system in particular, which is 4 times more expensive than the bus system. The work that I presented on is part of the Bus Revolution project, which will be implemented over the next several years, which will hopefully really transform the bus system in the region. So the work I do is, I'm a planner, so sometimes I see things go on the shelf, but often we do get our work implemented pretty quickly, and more so right now as there's more and more funding and more interest. So it's a really, really exciting time to work in the field.
Professor Larry Lewis.
Thanks, Professor. Talking about mass transit, changing fares quite often doesn't necessarily make the results that you think. Athens, I now live in Athens, Georgia, and Athens, Georgia is a sort of strange place when you look at it within the context of Georgia. And in our county, we have absolutely free mass transit. And the whole idea was this would have a tremendous import for at least the people in the lower income. And interesting enough, it's turned out to have some really socioeconomic components. On cold days, they find out now that free transit has become a major place for homeless people to live. And so they stay on the mass transit. And so all I'm saying is, it turns out, like in most things, when you think logically, that something else always strange appears. And it's a really major problem because the surrounding counties have been dumping off everyone that's homeless into our county. And I think it's finally been able to be stopped. But I'm just saying you can do as many studies as you want, and then suddenly something weird occurs. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. That is an issue that we are seeing, particularly with fare-free systems, but also just public transit in general right now, as a lot of social safety nets kind of erode around us. A lot of times transit sort of picks up the pieces in a way that's unfortunate for everybody, including people who don't have a place to live, and that's kind of their last resort, is to hang out on a bus all day, as well as folks who are trying to ride the bus to get around as well. But I do want to say that, like, for instance, the WRTA being free since COVID, the WRTA did see still saw ridership decreases throughout 2020 and 2021, but at the lowest rate in the state, and that can only be attributed to the fare becoming free. So there's always going to be externalities you don't expect, but I also want people to leave thinking that fare-free transit can be a very, very positive thing.
Dr. Lewis was a professor here for several years, and now we go to a present professor, Florencia Sangermano.
Hi, thank you for great presentations. So with technology advancing so fast in the latest years, so this question is for kind of like whoever wants to take it in the panel. I was wondering, how do you see these new technological advances influencing the work that you're doing?
Do you want to clarify it all? Just that I say that because there's
so many technological.
many.
Yes, and like now we have like the whole AI things. We have the new cloud computing and all these things. So I kind of like wondering how like this new technological of AI or like cloud computing kind of like facilitates the work, or like you will see like you will change or influence the, I don't know, the more applied work in terms of forestry and polar, or like even like the development of software.
Yeah, so I'll venture like a quick thought on that. Lyndon Estes and I have explored deep learning, a component of artificial intelligence, as a tool for image classification. And there's no question that it has demonstrated some amazing capabilities, but it also comes with a huge investment in understanding and learning how to parameterize these things. So the burden that it puts on our profession in terms of the background that you have to have is quite enormous. And that's always been the case. I've often thought, being a professor in the GiScience realm has always been so challenging, because every year you're having to invest in learning new technologies. I kid you not, one class that I taught for many, many years and you now teach, I used to prepare for that with 22 hours of preparation for every lecture every year, just to keep up with technology. And so, along with some very interesting opportunities, there's also some sobering parts, which is that, oh my gosh, is this really technology that's ready for everyday use?
There we go. I think from my perspective, it's a question of the sorts of questions I get to ask. So I do a lot of computational heavy work. It's not at all what I talked about today, but in the past, even say I would run into limits of resources, right? Like, so I'm thinking about this one particular problem where I needed to be able to generate like an 81 billion point mesh network, right? Like of all points to all points for analysis. And I couldn't do it. And, just this year, I got access to a machine where I can do it. And that didn't change the types of questions I was asking, and it didn't change the type of research I was doing, but it did change the sort of methods that I could employ. And so I want to echo everything Ron said, where like, I tend to write very skeptically about technology, but I also see in my own work that as these, just as the sheer number of threads that I can get access to increases, that lets me ask different sorts of questions. Maybe a question that had to be answered in a more sort of like theoretical or model-based way can become more empirical in other ways. So that's kind of what I see.
I could add some thoughts as well. It's a great question. I think it can be answered in so many different ways. And I think for many of us, I'll just give you sort of one example, that the availability of very high spatial resolution data, I think in my case, kind of revolutionizes the types of science questions that you can ask. So for example, access to worldview and CubeSat and all your planet data, all sorts of different things that enable you to see things that you weren't able to formerly see. A big part of my research, for instance, is looking at melt ponding. And getting a sense of what the melt ponding distribution looks like on sea ice is incredibly informative for science questions, because those melt ponds act like skylights with light transmittance to the ocean water below. And so in the presence of melt ponds, we may see 70% of the light that's incident on the top of sea ice actually makes its way into the ocean, which has huge ramifications for ocean heating, for the degradation of dissolved organic material, and in particular for primary productivity. So the base of the food chain, which everything else in marine ecosystems is reliant upon. So being able to see those melt ponds at the relatively small scale, I think is incredibly useful. Being able to see the eddy development and how that links into primary productivity is something that you're able to do. Another really fun application that many have undertaken too is the enumeration of marine mammals as well. It's really important to have a sense of, for instance, how walruses are responding to the declines of sea ice.
Now, Karen, everyone downstairs is getting your insights
Oh no,
also.
are you serious? How embarrassing.
Try this one. And then I think we'll give this one to the people downstairs.
This gives a whole new meaning to the term concurrent sessions.
That's right. That's right. So you can count walrus, right? So you know about walrus, right? So in the absence of sea ice, walruses have to go to coastal haulouts, which is incredibly problematic because you have trampling, you have disease, you have predation, all sorts of different things. But being able to have a sense of where these 10,000 individual animals are herding on these coastal sites, we can see that with remote sensing, and you wouldn't be able to have answered those questions otherwise. So.
And Professor Kulakowski will give us our closing comments before we go for refreshment.
Okay. Hopefully this is in this room. So, if nothing else impresses you about Clark's geography, it's the fact that we can make you be in 2 sessions at the same time. So remember that about us. But then, just building off of Karen's point about the remote sensing, I absolutely agree with that. And also, I think that there are questions from the ecological side that we desperately need to resolve that we can't because of remote sensing limitations. So, for example, globally, ecosystems are changing. We can remotely detect when a forest becomes a non-forest, but we're not great about seeing what is coming back in those initial stages of ecosystem trajectories. We can see that there's something green there. We can't tell whether those are tree seedlings or grasses or shrubs in many cases, which has huge implications for future ecosystem trajectories. Similarly, we do a good job of characterizing canopies, but seeing what's underneath the canopy is much more difficult still. In a lot of environments, whereas those sub-canopy, the vertical structure and composition has huge implications for what will follow in the future. And those limitations are being addressed, and I think in 10 years they won't be there to the degree that they are now, but they do limit us still.
Well, let's give our presenters a round of applause for their efforts. So I believe, the program says that there are refreshments in the Jefferson hallway, which I assume requires you to go down 1 flight of stairs. And then the next sessions are scheduled to begin at 3:45, and do not trust that clock.